know the dollar terms is that much necessarily above. DoD divides its efforts into synchronization, which is coordinating words and deeds, a culture of communication, and then deliberate communication, which is more like the kind of public diplomacy that most people think of. The recent DoD, interesting, the State Department report and a DoD report came out within a week of each other on the national framework for what they call strategic communication. Talks more than interesting than the State Department framework about understanding the attitudes, opinions, grievances, and concerns of peoples, not just the elites, around the world. That's interesting. The Defense Department emphasizes that. The State Department is more about, our stuff going out. And let me say that I've talked to enough military officers and civilians in the Defense Department to say that the DoD is very serious about this. It's lives, as they see it out in the world today. Returning to cultural diplomacy per se, I think the case needs to be made persuasively to public and private decision makers in this country, and it needs to be made in ways that will resonate, as Bob Lynch, who runs Americans for the Arts, would say, has said numerous times, in ways that will appeal to those decision makers, which is not necessarily about the arts and the humanities, but is about stability and economic development and all those sorts of things. A retired brigadier general with whom I'm collaborating with regard to the Defense Department argues that cultural diplomacy is another tool in the toolkit to achieve security cooperation. Now, I think one other quick point I should make is if you go up on the Hill, John, you may know this, I don't know, but I found it interesting that it is the Armed Services Committees, not the Foreign Relations Committees, who spend the most time on again, I'm talking public diplomacy, not just cultural diplomacy, on this. And why that is not entirely clear. And while the Secretary of Defense wants to transfer resources to the State Department so the civilian things are happening more on the civilian side, there is a real question as to whether the congressional committees, both the authorizing and the appropriations committees, will actually permit this, even if the working group that is currently underway between Defense and State come up with a conclusion there. Finally, a plug for the arts and humanities in all of this. The arts tell stories. They move people to understand and appreciate the differences and commonalities of people. From the past, there are the voices of the silence, and the present. There are numerous stories, like I'm going to pick a non-American one, the Songs of Migration concert in Johannesburg with the extraordinary trumpeter Hugh Masekela. And the New York Times, this is the point, reports that the Market Theater was surely one of the most integrated multi-generational gatherings anywhere in South Africa, and the whole audience cheered when the old national flag of apartheid was lowered stage left and the new South African flag rose stage right. That's a South African story. An American story is Yo-Yo Ma and the Silk Road Project. How many of you know about the Silk Road Project? Some people are nodding. It's most extraordinary, and Yo-Yo Ma gets enormous credit for having started this quite a few years ago. And I will never forget being on the Mall on a very hot day in Washington at the first of these, the Smithsonian, put it on. Excuse me. And you could just see in the faces of these guys from the stands in South Asia and so on and so forth, how impressed they were by the fact that they were invited to the United States to perform. It was on July 4th, actually, on the Mall. And then the State Department reporting afterwards showed that there was a huge difference in attitudes as a result of this. People were talking about it all over Central Asia and so on. So that's the kind of measurement that we're talking. We were also asked to talk about measures. I think I'll skip that. Finally, I'll just say a word about the summit, because I'm going to put a request out to everybody in the room. The summit is an initiative of the U.S. Center for Global Citizen Diplomacy, which I really like because it's headquartered in Iowa, and I think that's kind of neat. It will take place in Washington November 16 to 19. They are partnering with the State Department, and as I say, they had this Secretary of State and will probably have the President at this. And the goal is to increase the number of Americans engaged in international volunteer activity from an estimated 60 million today to 120 million in 2020. The summit will include 12 task forces. One of them is on cultural engagement. I'm co-chaired with a woman by the name of Cynthia Schneider, who used to be the ambassador to the Netherlands. She's now at Brookings and Georgetown. The objective of our task force and all the task forces is to solicit, select, and showcase on the order of 10 exemplars of citizen international cultural engagement in order to encourage for these activities increased support, broad citizen involvement, and increased media coverage. And this summit, incidentally, will be the first of these since President Eisenhower's 1956 People-to-People Partnership Conference. So my request out to all of you is, if any of you have any thoughts as to exemplars, projects that really work, the John Bradamus Center has my contact information. Throw them in. And with that, I thank you, and on to my fellow panelists.
Do we applaud? I thought that was excellent. Thank you so much. Good morning. My name is Rochelle Roca Hashem. I'm the culture officer at UNESCO, as was stated. I'm just going to do a quick overview on what is UNESCO, because I don't think that's very, very well known in the US, in some communities, hopefully more known among you. And then I'll go into some specifics of what UNESCO is doing in this field of cultural diplomacy. Probably more for us as well, we would say engagement. So first of all, UNESCO, Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. We are based in Paris, and we are an intergovernmental organization. We are the intellectual branch of the UN. We are working on what would be considered the soft issues, because we are looking at peace, security, sustainable development through what? Through culture, education, and science. So within UNESCO, we approach our mandate really through what we call a cultural diversity lens. UNESCO was formed in the wake of World War II. There was so much destruction, obviously. There was a lot of misunderstanding. And initially, what the founders of UNESCO were thinking was, oh, well, we have to rebuild schools and we have to rebuild many of the cultural monuments that were destroyed. But the thinking evolved, and in particular in the US delegation that was among the founders of UNESCO, they started to think more outside the box, and they said, you know, if we really focus more on international efforts in education, and we really focus more on understanding what is the situation of other people, what is the thinking of other people, what are the problems of other people, through those types of initiatives, we can go a lot further in peace and security and development than we could through just signing a treaty. So we're not talking about nuclear disarmament so much, and we're not talking about vaccinations like different agencies within the UN, but we are really looking at that intellectual, academic, the changing of the minds kind of work. And in fact, it was a member of the US delegation forming UNESCO, Archibald MacLeish, who was a poet, who gave one of the founding lines of UNESCO's preambular sentences of our Constitution, which says, and think about this, since wars begin in the minds of men, and we should say women now, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. So we're talking about changing minds, and that means education and exchange and understanding. All of these efforts within UNESCO, which I'll highlight a few of them, reach out to mutual understanding, breaking down stereotypes, breaking down misunderstandings, mutual respect. But all of these cultural initiatives that we work on also deal with not only establishing social cohesion and peace in that sense, but they also deal with development. We need sustainable development, and culture is very, very much an impact in development, whether it's through cultural industries, whether we're talking about the film industries or arts and crafts, but also even if you're going to educate with what we call the Millennium Development Goals, if you're trying to educate people about HIV/AIDS education, or if you're trying to raise literacy rates, or if you're trying to talk about gender parity and gender equality, all of those goals have to be addressed through culture. You can't educate about HIV/AIDS education with a Western mind, with a Western approach, when you're talking about a very closed, perhaps Islamic society, and these issues of sexual practice are very sensitive. We need a culturally sensitive approach to everything that we do. We can't think about literacy or decreasing poverty if we're not focusing on languages. If you're trying to reach the marginalized people in many countries, you have to approach them through their mother tongue education. Or if you're trying to talk about gender parity, gender equality, again, you have to have that cultural sensitivity approach into your programming, into what you're going to do. The same things, I would argue, apply very much to individuals and the private sector. A lot of our cultural diplomacy or cultural exchange happens not just through governments, and I'm going to be talking about the governments and the international community, the UN angle, but just to toss out a little bit about the other parties who play in cultural diplomacy aside from governments, as was alluded to also by Frank Hotzel. If you're a company working internationally, a multinational company, for example, I know examples of Coca-Cola in Indonesia. They're bringing American culture, American work ethics, American practices into their factories in Indonesia, but they're smart because at the same time they're engaging very much with their local population, their local markets. Who are they employing? Who are they selling to? When Ramadan comes, actually the Coca-Cola company in Indonesia is actually celebrating Ramadan, giving alms to the poor, embracing exactly those cultural practices and traditions of where they are because that makes for good communication. My husband happens to be a Shiite Muslim from Lebanon. When I go to the village in the south of Lebanon, I'm not, even though it's hot, I'm not going to wear my shorts and my tank top. It's not respectful. Out of cultural diplomacy, mutual respect, understanding, I'm going to be sensitive to how I should behave. So it's individuals as ambassadors, it's companies as ambassadors, and then of course we come into the government approach. So, UNESCO. Building that mutual understanding through culture, education, communication, and science. What are some of the things we do? We recognize that there is hatred, violence, mistrust, misunderstanding, stereotypes in the world. So how are the ways that we can approach these issues? First and foremost, from our perspective, it is through education. We are working with our member state governments, but we are also working with academic communities and researchers so that we can research, understand what works, what doesn't work, come up with policies, come up with guidelines. So for example, UNESCO has guidelines that we give to our member states on intercultural education. How are you going to teach about world religions? How are you going to teach about history? How are you going to change curricula and change what is in some of the content of textbooks so that we are giving accurate information, debunking the stereotypes, educating young people? We have to do that through government policy, so we provide guidelines, we provide information so that our member states can, well, they can take it or leave it. We're not sure how we can measure issues of cultural diplomacy and whether they're effective or not. But when we see that a curricula is changing or that textbooks are being revised and they're becoming more accurate and they're being very sensitive to the different communities, to minority groups, to indigenous people's issues, which were perhaps in the past not addressed fairly, then we know that we're attaining some successes. We also do teacher training workshops, and we also do projects. I'm kind of not following my notes very well, sorry, I'm jumping around the place. I'm just thinking of one of the exchange programs that UNESCO is engaged in. It's called the Mondialogo project. This is where we take groups of high school students, high schools in all the countries of the world. We have 193 member states. We take a group that is going to make a team effort towards one of the important initiatives of UNESCO. It might be on sustainable development, it might be on intercultural dialogue. So you have a team that is composed of Iran and Mexico, or you might have a team that is composed of Spain and Indonesia, or a team that is Lebanon and China. So these teams get together and they are actually put into communication, thank goodness, through the internet, so we have the technology to do this. But they are working together, these young people, across cultural barriers and across language barriers, to come up with a project together that is going to be able to help with literacy in Africa or some specific theme for that year. And it is a great way to bridge those cultural divides, get the teamwork going, understand one another, and actually they come out with something that's very useful and productive, because many of these projects are actually implemented by governments afterwards. So this is just one example of what UNESCO does, and there are the prizes each year, and which team won for the best coordination and then the best project outcome. Other things that UNESCO does is what I would say are standard-setting instruments. We have declarations, we have recommendations, and we have conventions. So there are a lot of UNESCO international conventions that protect cultural heritage, one of which I'm sure you're all familiar with are the World Heritage Sites, the cultural and the natural sites. We also have a convention protecting cultural objects under threat in times of conflict. We have a convention on intangible cultural heritage, which is rather new. It's from 2003. That means dance, literature, oral tradition, poetry. Some countries are arguing now that their food is also part of their intangible cultural heritage. Why are all these things important? It's because we want the world to recognize that culture, those forms of cultural heritage, whether it's a monument, whether it's a mountain that has indigenous people living around it who have a spiritual value tied to that natural site, whether it is a traditional puppet show or traditional singing, these are all parts of our identity. They're parts of who we are. They express how people view the world. It's your way of communicating also. So UNESCO has these conventions which emphasize the importance of culture, identity, tradition, because we want to have those means of mutual recognition. When you travel to another World Heritage Site and you get to know what is important for these people, what was the civilization that built this? Why are they so proud of it? Why should they protect it? These are mechanisms by which we can learn about one another and ultimately gain respect and understanding for another people. Through intangible cultural heritage, many of the, for example, the African traditions, in Africa you'll see, if you look at the World Heritage map, we have 890 sites. Well, I'm going to open this up really quick, but this is all available on the website. Initially, when we started World Heritage Sites,
Okay.
yeah, it's very tiny, but you'll see where the red dots are. Well, you can't see, it's too small. A lot of them are in the West. They're in Europe, for example. We recognize, at Notre Dame, we recognize Rome, we think about the pyramids and the Taj Mahal. Africa also has a lot of rich cultural heritage, but they didn't have as many built sites. They have natural sites. But they said, we have so much culture, but it's not recognized by a red dot on a map. Our culture is very much our oral tradition, our dance, our religious beliefs. And so we said, yeah, this is also worthy of universal respect and recognition. So this is how the idea of the intangible cultural heritage came to be. And now it's just taken off. Around the world, we have many, many traditions that are now signed up on what we call the representative list of intangible cultural heritage, because this too is part of a people, it's part of their past, so we need to understand and respect that. One last convention which is interesting, it is the Convention for the Diversity of Cultural Expressions, which is rather new, and it talks about film and radio.